We have a really tight agenda, so we're going to go ahead and get started right on schedule today. So, hi everyone. I wanted to have a chance to welcome you to our Ignite event. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. I think I know most of you who are in this room. We are also joined by a lot of people online, and so wanted to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Sue Kearns. I'm the Director of Transformative Research at the Kempe Center. And I'm also the co-editor, along with John Fluke and Dana Hollingshed, of the special issue that we're celebrating today that's been being published in the International Journal of Child Maltreatment. The special issue provides examples of the research that's happening here at Kempe, including work that's being done in close collaboration with other sites, both domestic and international. The studies roughly fall into one of kind of three main categories that you'll hear about today, including epidemiology, prevention and intervention, ecological workforce, and system studies. So you're going to hear more about those as we move together today. But I do want to note here that the research examples in the special issue and that you're going to hear about today are only a taste of the exciting research that's happening at the center. I invite you to connect with the researchers that are here today, and also reach out to explore the other work that's happening that's not represented in the body of talks that are part of this event. So we have included email addresses for all of our speakers if you want to connect after the presentations. And I also encourage you to visit our website. We're actively working on updating our website as we speak. So also check back regularly, as much of the research that's happening at Kempe will continue to be highlighted in different ways as we build out our new website. Today's event is a special format of quick-paced overviews of research that was inspired and incorporated into the special issue. Each talk is only 5 minutes in length, containing 20 slides that auto-advance every 15 seconds. We hope that you're going to find it lively, thought-provoking, informative, and inspiring. Of course, with only 5 minutes per presentation, there's not a lot of room for details. So we encourage you to submit questions using the QR code that's up there. There may be some limited time at the very end of the presentation to do some brief Q&A, but in the event that doesn't happen, for those who are here in person, we welcome you to also ask questions of the presenters during the reception that is going to be just downstairs and is being sponsored by the Kempe Foundation, in which we want to extend our gratitude and thanks. For those of you who are joining us virtually, I want to acknowledge you as well. Thank you for attending. Though we won't be able to toast you at the reception directly after the event, we do hope that you feel welcomed and included. And I also note that 3 of our presenters are joining us virtually, 2 of whom are located in the Arctic region of Norway. So this is truly a hybrid event. Finally, before we launch into the event, I want to acknowledge the instrumental support of Kempe Center staff, Josh, Lossie, Ruth, and Julia, all who helped tremendously in various aspects of this event. And also John and Jeremy from the Kempe Foundation, who are supporting the reception after this event. So heartfelt thank you and tons of gratitude. This could not be possible without all of your efforts. So without further ado, let's launch into the main event. Please remember to post questions using the QR code. Any questions that we don't answer during our hour together will be provided after the event by email. So we have John Fluke here, our first presenter, up to the stage, and let's get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Now I get to be the test. Hi, I'm John Fluke with the Kempe Center. Our work on COVID-19 and the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System has been a collaboration between the Kempe Center System Group and WRMA, Inc., which among other projects operates the NCANs for the U.S. Children's Bureau, which helps support this work. Of course, those of us in the public health space know it's not over, but some of the early impacts, including the initial lockdown, have of course ended. However, as we shall see, the lockdown was very disruptive to the Child Protective Service system in the U.S. As a general comment, we seem to do a poor job taking forecasts about potential disruption as seriously as we should. Forecasting is difficult. It would be reassuring to think that we would learn something of importance from the COVID outbreak to help ensure that our systems work better when faced with disruptive events. As a global society, we know that COVID has had an impact on children. It's affected their education, their mental health, the experience of intimate partner violence, and resulted in more children being orphaned. But how has it changed child maltreatment? To help understand child maltreatment data, here we have a figure of an iceberg where what's below the surface is difficult to see. Much of what is known depends on the source of data and the study design. The red circles represent what is typically an administrative data source. The blue depicts multi-source sentinel studies, and the green is the portion of the iceberg that can be detected by self-report studies. The red circle represents the NCANS data I'm talking about today. Ideally, to fully understand the impact of COVID on child maltreatment, we need to have information from a comprehensive child maltreatment data collection program. Unfortunately, because of the timing and resources needed to collect data, we don't know much about COVID impacts from Sentinel or self-report data, but we do have administrative data. For child protection services in the US, disruption to normal responses to referrals began with the COVID lockdown around week 11 or mid-March of 2020. Compared to 2019, responses were much lower in 2020, the orange bars. In 2020, though, a large percentage of those children were substantiated or determined to be a victim of child maltreatment, or a larger proportion. Almost all sources of referral to child protection were lower during the COVID-19 lockdown, but reports from school were the lowest at 90% of the numbers of referrals during the same period in 2019. Referrals from all sources during the lockdown, except schools, were more likely to result in a maltreatment substantiation or victimization compared to prior years. So turning to the article for the Kempe 50th anniversary, our team looked at urban versus rural differences in responses. At the county level, we were able to verify that rates per thousand children in a CPS response were lower in urban areas compared to rural areas. This didn't really change during the COVID lockdown, but rates declined in both urban and rural areas compared to the same period in 2019. When we looked further, though, we found that when we compared the urban and rural rates directly, that urban rates went down more during the COVID-19 lockdown compared to the rural rates. From our analysis based on county data, we learned that the reductions in rates were tied to the time point when COVID was first identified in the county, where rural areas tended to identify COVID later than urban areas. For the next steps, we are examining the possibility that differences in COVID-19 experience in urban and rural areas may have also influenced racial disparities in CPS responses, particularly for African American and Native American children. Child protection responses declined significantly during the COVID lockdown period. Schools were a big driver, but responses were reduced among all referral sources. From NCANS, we know that reporting in rural areas occurs at a higher rate compared to urban areas. During the lockdown period, the disparity between urban and rural areas became even greater. This has implications for better understanding child protection systems, such as the causes of observed racial disparities. A comprehensive triangulation approach to monitoring risk and exposure during social disruptions is needed. We seem content to wash our hands when the great waves crash on our society, even when we understand that with more knowledge, we could do better. So Kettle, I think it's over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Ketil Leonard Hansen, and I am professor in public health at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about my new study, the Arctic Childhood Study. But before that, I will tell you about my family picture. It's taken in 1897 in my hometown Lødingen in Arctic Norway. And I am an indigenous Sami, and I grow up in a reindeer herding family. The Sami people who lives in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia are one of the indigenous people in the Arctic. The size of the Sami population is around 100,000 persons, and 70% of the Sami people live in Arctic Norway. The Arctic Childhood Study aimed to fill a major gap of knowledge about the experience of abuse and neglect among indigenous Sami children and youth in Arctic Norway in the age from 13 to 24 years old. The proposed study is the first longitudinal research project of its kind in Norway, with a particular focus about violence against indigenous Sami and non-Sami in Arctic Norway. We know that Sami adult women are more likely to report emotional, physical, and sexual violence than the majority people in Arctic Norway. More than 1/3 of the Sami men and less than a quarter of the non-Sami men reported any violence. And violence was typically reported to have occurred in childhood. This study had a mixed method design, including evaluation of pilot study, focus group interview, and we combined qualitative and quantitative data. Research activity, including language translation of the ICAST questionnaires, pilot study of Norwegian and Sami language questionnaire with focus group discussion, and main study with cohort study design using questionnaire, school-based survey, and home-based survey with long-term following up. The Arctic Childhood Study covered the sub-Arctic and Arctic parts of Norway, which is the most populated region in the Arctic, where the majority of the indigenous Sami people live. Our pilot study will be conducted in 2 municipalities in Arctic Norway, where we test the ICAST questionnaire in Norwegian and the 3 Sami languages. A part of the pilot study will be including focus group interview, where youth reflect on, for example, how we ask about the question about abuse and neglect. Data will be collected from youth up to 4 times point at 3 years interval, from they are 13 years old until they are 24 years old. Since information about ethnicity is not available in National Register in Norway, we include several questions about ethnicity in the questionnaire, for example, about ethnical background, language, and use of language at home. This is the culture-sensitive childhood concept model. The Arctic Childhood Study will explore culture risk and protective factors and their relation to abuse and neglect. We will measure the relationship between violence, risk, and protective factors across multiple levels of influence, between and within subgroups. Given additional and ethical permission, we will link our data to Norwegian register, such as school dropout, social security benefits, or an health registers. The hope is that the information will provide a better foundation for formulating culture-sensitive prevention strategies aiming and reducing violence and neglect in Sami communities. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, my name is Heather Allen, and I am a senior instructor at the Kempe Center, and I served as the evaluation manager of the Colorado Community Response Pilot Program that I will speak to you about today. But before we dive into that study and those findings, I'd like to do some level setting with you. What do we think of when we think of child maltreatment? What types of stories do we hear when child protection is discussed in the news? We often hear horror stories of egregious harm and abuse. We think of small, scared children, afraid and hurting, being harmed by someone who's supposed to care for them. And in this scenario, who are parents? They are perpetrators, abusers. Parents are people whom children must be protected from. This is a narrative of helplessness and fear. But when we look at the numbers, that's not the story that we predominantly see. In stark contrast to the media portrayal of child maltreatment, up to 3/4 of CPS substantiations are actually found around neglect. So what is neglect? According to the federal government, a type of maltreatment that refers to the failure of a caregiver to provide needed care, although financially able to do so. So let's break that down a little bit. When we talk about needed care, we're really talking about those basic needs. When we think about Maslow's hierarchy, those are at the bottom. Food, water, shelter, warmth, care, safety, security, and even some of the psychological needs around emotional development. And when we think about, although financially able to do so, and we see who CPS, families who CPS tends to be involved with, we see that the vast majority of these families encountering child protection are experiencing poverty, and oftentimes severe so. So where does that leave us? There's a growing discussion in policy circles around the conflation of poverty and neglect in the context of child welfare. And the question is, can we prevent the latter by addressing the former? Enter Colorado Community Response. This is a program that was piloted in Colorado from 2014 to 2018. It's a voluntary comprehensive case management program administered primarily by community providers, not the formal child welfare system, to families who've been reported but screened out of child welfare. Its primary goal is to reduce child welfare reinvolvement through increasing family protective capacities, addressing that link between poverty and maltreatment, and providing comprehensive voluntary case management services. And when we look at who was served by CCR, we saw that 80% of caregivers reported a household income of less than $30,000, with nearly half making less than $10,000. The bottom line is this is an economically vulnerable population. And when we asked families what they needed at Prest, they told us housing, employment, mental health, cash savings, food security, and income. What are those things? Those are our Maslow's basic needs. And when we look at what families actually got pre to post through CCR, we saw statistically significant, substantial reductions in their needs around housing, employment, mental health, cash savings, and food security. When we look at protective factors, we saw statistically significant increases in all protective factors, with the largest changes being in those areas of concrete support, social support, knowledge of parenting, and resiliency. And critically, when we talked to families, they were overwhelmingly positive and satisfied with the services they received through CCR. Substantial majority said that the services they received were very effective in solving their problems and that their family was better off because of their experience with CCR. And finally, when we look at the goal of child welfare reinvolvement, we see that when compared against a matched comparison group of similar families who did not receive CCR, treatment families were statistically significantly less likely to experience a substantiation or an out-of-home placement. By all indicators, CCR was successful in achieving its primary goal of reducing child maltreatment by addressing that link between poverty and neglect through the provision of concrete and supportive services. This is a hopeful story. And yet, this style of voluntary prevention program is notoriously hard to outreach for. We are not reaching the majority of families who may need assistance, but when we do reach those families, we can help them. The moral of this story is that most families encountering the child welfare system are experiencing poverty. These are parents doing their level best to provide for their families, and they need help and support, not disruption. Programs like Community Response can provide that help. And the last thought I'll leave you with is that when we think about policy, we need to be thinking about how we can lower the barriers to assistance to reach the maximum amount of families in order to really move the needle on child maltreatment reduction. But that's a discussion for another day. Thank you.
The Fostering Healthy Futures program was launched 20 years ago right here at Kempe under the tutelage of Dr. David Olds, my postdoctoral mentor. I will spend the next 4 minutes and 46 seconds sharing key lessons learned from this program of clinical research. Fostering Healthy Futures, or FHF, is a mentoring and skills training preventive intervention developed for young people who have experienced maltreatment and involvement with the child welfare system. We have conducted 3 randomized controlled trials to examine its efficacy with preteens and teens. FHF uses a combination of one-on-one mentoring and skills training with young people. It is a positive youth development program supporting young people in exploring their interests, goals, and visions for the futures. FHF has demonstrated positive effects on child welfare placement and permanency outcomes, delinquency and juvenile justice involvement, and children's mental health functioning. I would argue the most important outcome, however, is better quality of life. Because the program's impact has been independently and favorably reviewed by several registries of evidence-based programs and compendia, we are now implementing the program more widely through community-based organizations. We attribute much of our success to the fact that we focus on diagnosing promise, not pathology, which reduces stigma and enhances engagement. Routinely, 85 to 95% of children graduate from the 9-month program. The positive feedback we get from program stakeholders such as this helps ensure we are on the right track. Interviews conducted with program participants an average of 10 years post-program resulted in 95% of them spontaneously saying something positive when asked, "Tell us about your experiences in FHF." As one participant stated, quote, "I loved my mentor. I still have a photo journal of everything that we did together. I would leave footprints on her car window and I still have that picture. She was such a big impact because when I thought that no one really wanted me, she was right there." Data collected through intervention research can have implications far beyond the actual program being studied. Our non-intervention publications, with some of the titles shown here, has been included in policy briefs and cited in congressional testimony. We've also learned about the important power of stakeholder voice. Not to toot our own horn here, but we have been listening to children and to their family members and caseworkers since the start of FHF. This has not only helped us design more sensitive and culturally inclusive interventions, but has also enabled us to publish policy-relevant papers using longitudinal data from young people with lived experience, 2 of which were recently published in a special issue of this journal. In the first of these 2 papers, we examined the impact of turning points in the lives of young people. We found that adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, were not surprisingly related to lower life satisfaction. However, having any type of turning point, a positive or negative experience or realization, buffered the impact of ACEs on well-being. In a second paper in the same journal, we conducted a mixed method study with over 200 participants who were asked the same questions about being placed in out-of-home care in both pre-adolescence and young adulthood about 10 years later. At both ages, over 80% of participants reported that it was somewhat or very helpful to have been placed in out-of-home care. A much smaller percentage of young adults than preteens, however, felt that their lives would have been better if they had never been removed from their homes. However, as you can see here, 20% more young adults than preteens reported that it was very difficult to have been placed in out-of-home care. Many reported that they did not get enough information from their caseworkers and almost never had enough to say about what happened to them. Finally, participants' open-ended responses to the question about how they would change the child welfare system varied from nothing to impassioned responses about the need for better oversight, giving birth parents more time before removal, and keeping siblings together. Unfortunately, youth voice is often absent from these conversations that have such weighty implications. Although young people's views of the child welfare system and of being placed in out-of-home care are complicated, we, as researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, would do well to similarly approach reform with such nuance. At FHF, we believe that valuing the voices of diverse youth with diverse child welfare experiences will be critical to developing culturally attuned, supportive, and effective youth and family-centered policies and practices now and in the future. Of course, I did not do this work alone. This picture is from our 15-year celebration to be updated this spring when we celebrate the 20th anniversary of FHF. I wish I could be there in person today to celebrate Kempe's 50th with you all. Thank you so much.
Hello, and welcome to this Ignite talk on foster care entry and healthcare utilization. I'm Becky Orsi-Hunt, and here with my colleague, James Cafferly. Why is this topic important? Because within current service systems, it's estimated that over 6% of US children will enter foster care prior to their 18th birthday. Entries into care in Colorado are tracked by the Child Welfare Case Management and Information System called TRAILS. And since most children and youth in care are eligible for Medicaid, their healthcare use is tracked in Medicaid administrative data. Given these two data sources, you would be correct to conclude that the best way to answer questions about changes in healthcare use around the point of foster care entry is to bring the two data sets together. Each data source provides a strength: TRAILS for information about timing of foster care entry, and Medicaid data for healthcare use and patient health complexity. Such data linkage for research is still limited, but growing. The upcoming graphs in a couple more slides focus on the major event for the child, entry to care. We have a unique opportunity to access data between 2014 and 2021, providing a look prior to and after a care entry. To date, research is lacking on healthcare trends before a child's entry. To highlight differences in healthcare use, we built a matched group of child peers who never entered foster care, similar in age, gender, family income, health conditions, and other characteristics. We posed two questions. Does primary care use differ for children who do and do not enter care? And does behavioral health use differ for children who do and do not enter care?
To the first question, yes, primary care use did differ. A lower percentage of children who entered care received primary care in the 12 months prior to entry, but we saw a reversal of trends subsequent to entry compared to matched peers. Additionally, use of behavioral health services differed. Again, compared to these peers, the percentage of children who received behavioral health services and entered foster care was twofold greater before entry, fourfold higher during the month of entry, and sevenfold higher thereafter. We know that health complexity influences utilization, so we differentiated our cohort into 4 health complexity categories. And the next slides will display the average use among children between the two cohorts in the 25 months. Those children without health complexity appear on the left, and those with concurrent conditions on the right. The foster care cohort is in the black line and the peers on the gray. We see across complexity higher use subsequent to care entry. The one outlier, those children who had concurrent physical and behavioral health use, although they had higher primary care use immediately after, we see that by 6 months, those percentages were equivalent. Among children who entered care, a higher percentage used behavioral health services, and we see that that was twofold higher, that those were twice that appears in the 12 months before, and increased up to 5 times thereafter. As we unpack our findings, we found that health complexity and child foster care entry were important drivers for care, and this can highlight opportunities to improve care for this population. However, we saw that health complexity, while foster care entry accelerated care, was not the primary driver for these increased healthcare use, service use. And so as we look toward future, we know that integrating information between Medicaid and child welfare data is key to advancing high quality evidence-based care and creates a gold standard. Our linked data set will allow us to continue to explore and answer some key questions.
For example, in our current data set, many visit types are still lumped together as primary care: vaccines, labs, face-to-face visits. If we were to break out the data differently, could we better understand what services children and youth access and what's driving the peaks and leveling in the graphs you saw?
You saw in our graphs that many children who enter care already are using behavioral services. The key question is, for those who enter, what does that do for the relationships they had with prior providers? And importantly, what diagnoses and key services are being provided for this population? We thank you for your time, and we're grateful for these partners who allowed us to advance this work. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dana Hollenshed, and I'm here with Becky Orsi to talk to you about turnover. In the child welfare field, it's estimated that 22% of caseworkers leave their jobs each year, and more than half leave within 2 years of starting. And that leaves many an agency feeling empty. Obviously, that's a problem for agencies, for the children and families they serve, for the co-workers left behind, and for agency budgets. Agencies generally spend between $23,000 to $65,000 to replace each person who leaves. In response, in 2016, the Children's Bureau funded the Quality Improvement Center on Workforce Development, a cooperative agreement with the University of Nebraska, Kempe, University of Louisville, and other partners. Our charge was to test interventions aimed at reducing turnover. 8 sites were selected. Sites interventions focused on job redesign, onboarding, secondary trauma, telework, tech supports, and organizational culture. In each site, we surveyed staff to learn about them prior to implementing their specific intervention. We used the ecological model of turnover intent to identify contextual factors that may influence turnover contemplation and actual turnover. Our surveys collected data on 2 of the 4 EMTI domains: organizational factors and caseworker factors. Our analysis explored 3 outcomes: thinking about quitting, intent to search, and intent to leave. The three scales have nuanced differences, so we tested them separately to determine whether caseworker and organizational factors had the same associations across measures. The predictive measures we explored focused on caseworker demographics, personality, stress, adverse childhood experiences, attitudes about child safety versus family preservation, and perceptions of leadership support if something on a case went awry.
So through the Quality Improvement Center, we surveyed essentially the entire case-carrying child welfare workforce in a large Midwestern state, which offers a really unique opportunity to look at the dynamics of how workers think about their own possible turnover. In round numbers, about 40% of these workers are single, 70% a primary wage earner, 80% identify as women or racially as white, 90% identify as straight rather than LGBTQ+, and their highest education level is a bachelor's degree. In terms of results, no demographic characteristics predicted turnover intentions. Personality measures such as conscientiousness matter early in our modeling process, but most fall out by the end, and ACE scores aren't predictive either. However, burnout, one of the stress measures, is consistently associated with turnover intentions. Higher burnout indicates stronger intentions to quit, search, or leave. And most important, workers' perception that agency leadership will support their decisions, even in the face of difficult case outcomes, consistently predicts those workers' turnover intentions. And to clarify that, better leadership decision support means that workers tend to express agreement with a statement such as, if a child in one of my cases is harmed, I believe the agency will conduct a thorough investigation before assigning blame. The bottom line here from this modeling work is that burnout and leadership decision support are key. This is an encouraging finding, as these factors are malleable. Agencies can develop strategies to address them, unlike demographic factors, which would not be responsive to an agency intervention. Now, a couple more things. A couple of our factors predict only one of the 3 outcomes, in addition to what I've shared with you already, suggesting that our outcomes may capture different phenomena, perhaps marking steps along the classic stages of change theory from pre-contemplation to action. Our future work will test hypotheses. Also, our future research will examine associations of all empty model factors and outcomes with actual turnover and time to turnover via linkage to human resources administrative data, which has rarely been done.
Most agencies don't use their HR data to its capacity, leaving big untapped opportunities to explore and understand workforce dynamics and issues in greater depth and breadth. In the years to come, we want to explore these issues, focusing on an array of ecological factors. We also lack insights about how caseworkers' experiences with their cases might contribute to their decisions to leave. Linking HR and case data may offer us insights about how work experiences, such as adverse case events, might contribute to turnover. Brandeis once likened states to labs conducting social experiments through their social policies. Multi-site projects like the Quick WD support exploring state differences, quickly replicating analyses in other jurisdictions, and building robust evidence about caseworker turnover. We end as we began by saying our agencies shouldn't be empty. Using insights from the EMTI model, we aim to provide the research needed so agencies can understand and reduce worker turnover and support overall well-being. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Svein. Today I want to talk about differences between child protection agencies. How large are they? What is the explanation? And should we be worried about such differences? Child protection agencies differ in size. In Norway, some have less than 5 workers, while the largest ones have more than 100. And there is large variation in organization and workflow in the case processing. We studied 1,400 cases from 16 agencies, and the chance of service provision varied from 22 to 60% among them. The mean was 38. Differences between agencies are often seen as a symptom of system failure, and we have seen a tendency to blame social workers for this. The argument is that if workers treat the same types of cases differently across agencies, then there must be a lack of professionalism in social work. This idea is of equal chance of service provision across the country are, however, based upon 2 presumptions. The first is that children and families' problems and needs are about the same everywhere, and we know that this is not true. The other is that access to other types of services are equal everywhere, and we certainly know that this is not true. So if children, families, and municipalities are not the same, why should service delivery rates be? Then this may actually illustrate the situation better. Then we should ask ourselves, are different animals treated differently within the zoo? And do different zoos have the same types of animals? In other words, how much of the variation is caused by differences between animals and how much is caused by differences between zoos? And as it turns out, the difference between animals from different parts of the zoo may actually be larger than the difference between the zoos. This is surely the case in child protection. In our study, we found that variation at the case level represented 98% of the total variation, and variation between agencies represented only 2%. So different cases are treated differently. The low interagency variation also indicates that very few cases are exactly the same. So to answer how they vary, we need to examine the types of concerns that are substantiated by agencies. In 9% of the cases, child abuse is substantiated. In 34%, there were neglect. And additionally, there were different types of caregiver risk factors, family risk factors, and child problems. So when abuse was substantiated, service provision was 37% more likely. Yet in only 18% of those cases, the decision was to remove the child. So the rest was offered home-based voluntary support. We counted 2 types of physical neglect, failure to provide basic care, failure to protect the child from danger, and we also recorded emotional neglect. In the presence of neglect, the chance of service provision was 18% higher. When there was caregiver risk, such as substance abuse, parental conflict, parental mental health problem, the chance of service provision increased with 8%. When there were child problems, such as child behavior, emotional problems, social functioning, the chance of service provision increased by 6%, and there was cumulative effect. Some agencies identified more child problems than did others. Family risk consisted of 6 types of concerns related to economy, housing, and stress, and it increased the chance of service provision by 4%. So in sum, the case level variation was explained by a multitude of case-specific concerns. But what about the variation at the agency level? We tested several possibilities: immigrant population, low-income households, initial screening threshold, none of which were actually significant predictors. High referral rates, though, reduced service provision, although not by much. An increase in 1 referral per 1,000 children only reduced service provision by 1%, so it takes a large difference in demand to produce a fairly little reduction in services. In agencies within the metropolitan area, there were lower chance for service provision. The largest difference was for problems related to child functioning. So this may be explained by the availability of other types of services. So when the availability of other support services differ across jurisdictions, the threshold for CPS should not be expected to remain the same. So do I worry about agency differences? Well, certainly less than before we conducted this study. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Warren Binford, and I'm excited to be with you here today. I am going to be talking to you a little bit about a line of research that started 10 years ago when I became involved with a US Supreme Court case that looked at the rights of children for restitution when they were victims of child pornography, what we often now call in our research child sex abuse material, CSAM. I came to understand when I became involved in that case and started to talk to survivors of this brutal crime that for some of these children, the trafficking in the abuse material was more difficult for them to recover from than the original hands-on abuse. And that was surprising to me, but it was something that ended up enlightening what we're learning about 21st century abuse and the impact that it has on our children that's different than in the 20th century, and the need to make sure that our frontline service providers are prepared. What we saw in a study by Julia Von Wheeler is that mental health providers felt that they weren't prepared to support survivors of CSAM, and in fact felt like failures in the work that they were providing these children. And so we started to look at not only mental health providers in the US and Canada, but at other professions as well to see if they felt prepared to do the work that today's survivors of child sex abuse often need. We started with research in the I-5 corridor on the US West Coast. The I-5 corridor runs from Mexico to Canada, and it is a common human trafficking corridor. And because we're seeing more instances of child sex abuse, we expected to see more instances of child sex abuse material being generated in that region. We met with people who were on the front lines, such as law enforcement, prosecutors, and child abuse centers, and asked them if they felt prepared and why or why not in semi-structured focus groups. What they talked a lot about were the challenges they faced, and they were multifold. They often didn't feel supported by ISPs, they didn't feel like they were current with technology, they weren't given enough resources, et cetera. And they consistently overall came up with two main facilitators that helped them to do their job well. One was more training, and the other one was multidisciplinary teams. So we have a path forward for how we can best help them. We then shifted our research into Canada, and we looked specifically in the province of Alberta, and we expanded our group of professions to also include educators in that region. And we also shifted our methodology so that we did cross-sectional surveys and asked them very specific questions, so it wasn't self-generated anymore, but we were trying to ask these different professions about specific questions or specific types of child abuse, two focused on offline abuse and two focused on online abuse. The hands-on abuse that we looked at was child sex abuse and grooming. Grooming, of course, can also take place online. And we specifically asked about luring, which under Canadian law is something that happens online. It's crime online, as well as CSAM. What we found across these professions is that child sex abuse is prevalent throughout Alberta, and that many of the frontline providers are encountering it in their daily work. What we found, though, is that in talking to these professionals, we learned that they did not feel prepared to deal with the online or tech-facilitated abuse. They felt like they were given a certain amount of training for the hands-on abuse, but their training was really lacking in that area. We also found that as a result of that, they didn't have as much confidence in their ability to respond to the children and survivors that they were interacting with because of that lack of training. So what do we do with this? One, it's clear we need to do a lot more research around CSAM, around luring, and other forms of tech-facilitated child abuse and child maltreatment. We also need to research what support these professionals need to be effective in the work that we do. We also need to innovate and be creative. We need to realize that our society is rapidly changing and that we need to respond to those changes by generating new ideas about how we can support survivors of these abuses as well as to prevent them in the first place. Of course, we need to advocate not just for the children, of course, but we need to advocate for the the service providers who are on the front lines trying to help these kids. We need to advocate with tech companies, we need to advocate with policymakers, and we need to advocate with funders. And of course, we need to educate. They told us we need more education, we need more training, and so we need to provide the education that our frontline service providers are asking for. Thank you.
9 tough acts to follow. Really terrific. Okay, the Back to the Future movie trilogy with Michael Fox was a classic. I chose this theme because I believe that many of our current professionals and researchers in the field of maltreatment, what am I supposed to do? Touch it?
Advance your slides here.
Well, why don't I just keep going and then I'll take all the time.
So when you're ready,
All right.
just click that once.
Once and it'll go. All right. Rewind. Back to the Future with Michael Fox was a classic. I chose this theme because I believe that many of our current professionals and researchers in the field of abuse and neglect have no understanding of the successes of the past. Modern attempts of protecting children from abuse and neglect have been going on for 60 years. Physical abuse and neglect was the initial focus and was going well until the mid-1970s, when the recognition of sexual abuse led to an implosion of CPS nationwide. Reports approached 2.4 million in the mid-80s. 30 to 50% of children who died of abuse had open cases. The focus of child welfare shifted from helping to investigation, and family court lawyered up and became adversarial. Ray Helfer spoke 35 years ago at the 15th anniversary of the Kempe Center and described how dysfunctional the system was. He then projected a process by which a national group led by the Kempe Center was able to design a new approach that got financial and political support from Congress. Should read his article, which is listed here, because he eloquently described the process needed to effect change and how it happened in his fantasy view of the future. Read the article in particular to see how it all depended on the funding of a supercomputer in a Midwest state. This report, super collider, not computer, this report led to 3 congressional hearings and 2 more major reports. Response to an emergency, neighbors helping neighbors, and child abuse fatalities. What happened? Not much. Despite being applauded by the field and Congress, nothing changed at the Administration of Children and Families. And in fact, most, if not all, federal legislation has just been tweaking. The Clinton administration killed the board. Don't assume it's Democrats who will solve this issue. The not-for-profit sector did respond, and home visiting got a boost with Healthy Families America and the Nurse Family Partnership. Gary Melton started Strong Communities for Children. There were 3 more major national reports that called for research, and the last one within our reach for taking a public health approach to child fatality prevention. What happened with these? Not much. Dozens and dozens of recommendations have been written and ignored for more than 3 decades. Policy has seesawed back and forth for 40 years. Started as the first national foundation formed to support research, training, prevention, and advocacy, like the March of Dimes, NCAN is looking to the millions of often silent survivors of child maltreatment to be an advocacy group. It asked, since it wasn't going to fund more of the same, if we should have a do-over, what should we do to assure that all 3 million children born this year will be free of abuse and neglect. $10,000 prizes were awarded to the authors of these 3 papers. Babcock's paper, contrasting our approach to child maltreatment with some childhood cancers, is outstanding. Training is harder to figure out. These papers suggested changes at the undergraduate, graduate, and professional levels, innovative, but in our view, not disruptive enough. If you really want to see examples of disruption, look at the University of Colorado here and Henry Silver, who disrupted medical education and the provision of care to children in the 1960s with the nurse practitioner and PA programs. There's a lesson there. So what should be next? Should we appoint another commission? Should we pass more laws? This quote from Albert Einstein is certainly appropriate at this point. What is next? Should we keep tweaking or start over? What's missing? All along, we've been missing a system for the continuous monitoring of the quality and outcomes of the children and families in the child protection system. Bottom line, we need a do-over, which needs to be thoughtfully planned and tested. Going back to the Helford 87 paper would be a good start. Major foundations could invest in testable alternative approaches to child protective services in 5 or 10 communities that are 5 to 10 year long projects. You could use the Rural Infant Care Program as a model. We can discuss this at the after party. And maybe by the Kempe Center's 75th anniversary, we'll be able to assure that all newborns in the United States can look forward to an abuse-free childhood. I want to thank Sue Kearns and Ruth Bernu for assistance with this because I'm still writing things out. Thank you.
Talk about tough acts to follow. I'm Dr. Kathy Wells. I'm the executive director of the Kempe Center, and huge thank you to Dr. Sue Kearns, to the entire team to put this together, all of the presenters in sharing your really, really important work, and really this format when I can't think of a better hour spent in recent memory hearing the incredible work that was presented. Each of the talks today really represents a unique phase in understanding the etiology, treatment, and systems impacts for children who have experienced maltreatment. In this way, these papers and these talks, when taken together, weave a very compelling story arc of why specific attention to this population remains critical. And we have much work to do. Collaboration with international colleagues is a specific emphasis of the work that we do at the Kempe Center. Partners in Norway were highlighted here, but across the center, there are collaborations that continue across the globe. Unfortunately, child maltreatment is ubiquitous, and learning from different settings and even different countries helps us to sort out what is unique in different settings and what is more universally needed to be addressed. Because looking forward to the next 50 years, we have a vision of reducing, if not eliminating, child maltreatment. And for those children and youth who do end up needing services, we want to ensure that those children receive gold standard, trauma-informed programming that meets their needs and supports their positive development. Our research team is and continues to be poised to continue tackling these substantial issues and providing much needed evidence to those practitioners, service designers, and public as we face this challenge together. This has been an exciting time, and I don't know, do we have a few minutes for some questions? I'm going to bring Sue back up here and let you lead that. Thank you so much for being here in person, virtually. I hope this is not the last time we get to do this together.
So we just have about 2 minutes, and questions are the only thing standing between us and the reception. But I do wonder if I saw, I'm going to pull up, there was one question that was posed in our Ignite Q&A, and that was from Marissa, who asked, I think this one is for you, Heather. Where were CCR services provided, in a community agency or home-based, and is it still available?
They are currently still being provided in a variety of jurisdictions, about 30 counties in Colorado, through community-based. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you probably, I think for the people online, they may not be able to hear you. Sorry. Okay, thank you.
So the question was, where is CCR and is it still available? The answer is yes, it is still available. We just evaluated the pilot program, but it is ongoing throughout the state of Colorado in upwards of 30 counties at last check. They are predominantly community-based providers, mostly family resource centers in the various communities. And in terms of whether it's home-based or community-based, the program is designed to be really focused on family needs and wants. So if a family prefers services to be provided in home, then they should be. And if they prefer to meet outside of the home, to come into the agency and receive other services concurrently, they are welcome to do that as well. So I would Google it if you're in Colorado and interested. However, the referral source is still through the formal child welfare system. So if this is a person off the street trying to receive services, they would have trouble getting CCR without that screen out.
Great, thank you, Heather. We are at the end of our time. So for anybody who is in person, if you have any lingering questions, please bring them to the reception. It'll be wonderful to have an opportunity to engage with the researchers there. Anyone online who has a question that didn't have an opportunity to pose it in our Q&A, please do so. We will send out a communication after this event that answers any questions that are there. So with that, I'll conclude the event. For those who are in person, we're just moving right downstairs, no jacket required. For a reception, please join us. And for everybody else, thank you so much for your time today.